back. You're watching Morning Live. Thanks so much for staying with us. Well, there's never a dull moment in South Africa's news and current affairs, and that could be none more true than in 2018. This year wasn't any different, from the Life Esidimeni Arbitrations to testimonies, from the state capture inquiry to protests by communities over gangsterism and crime. It's been a very busy year. To discuss a little bit of the stories that she covered, as well as SABC News, I'm joined now by my colleague and SABC News reporter Chriselda Lewis. Good morning and welcome to Morning Live.
Thanks, Valen. Nice to see you again.
How would you describe the news year in 2018?
Absolutely hectic if you're a journalist in South Africa. I think from what you've already said in your intro, to the Life Esidimeni arbitration hearings, to the fall from grace of former President Jacob Zuma. And I think in particular, Valen, what stood out for me, and I think which was a sticking point, and something that I will always remember, is when we heard in those arbitration hearings the extent of neglect against people who had basically hoped that the state would be able to look after them, and what kind of pain that the families themselves were going through. And I'm talking, of course, about the tragedy at Life Esidimeni, and how people were just taken and gone to NGOs that were unlicensed, how some of them died of dehydration. And to think how the families broke down and how they explained how their loved ones had just deteriorated. It was really something that I think many journalists will take with them into the future. And I think even though we've already had a pronouncement on the compensation that these families will have, obviously you can never put a price tag on someone's life. So you've got families who are saying, at least we know to a certain degree why this had happened, but they're not entirely satisfied with how everything panned out, and how, for example, you had people like the former MEC of Health, who they believe didn't tell the truth, and how you saw the likes of Barbara Creasy, for example, who's within the executive finance in the Gauteng provincial government, the MEC, how then she went on to explain that half of what we had thought as the media, perhaps relating to finances, perhaps there were not enough finances to look after the mentally ill patients. She painted a completely different picture, dispelling everything that had previously been put forward. So I think if you look at the extent, and one of the most embarrassing, I think, moments for the ANC-led government post-1994 is to have so many people die at the hands of institutions that were meant to look after some of the most vulnerable in society. So I think Life Esidimeni is certainly one of those stories where every time you hear about the extent of what these individuals had gone through, and how these families had to cope, how they looked, some of them for years, for their loved ones, you really get to understand the extent. You remember there were some pictures also, Valen, during one of the testimonies where one of the journalists, a photographer, had broken down, and it would explain to you the extent of how the impact, it just did not have an impact on the families, of course not downplaying the pain that they felt. We would never understand, but the pain that they felt. You also saw the retired Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke break down. So just sitting in that room and listening to the testimonies of these families and what their loved ones had gone through was absolutely harrowing.
I mean, if I think about being in the newsroom in 2018, sure, it was a year that felt like there was a constant assault on South Africa's moral conscience on so many levels, whether it be in society or amongst our politics. For you, who is out in the field and you've covered, you've covered those human interest stories, sure, you've been in the communities, you've followed the big inquiries. What was the one story that really impacted you personally?
Valen, I still think Life Esidimeni, okay, because in as much as, yes, we've gone out to cover amongst them, stories in the coloured communities where gangsterism and drug use, as we've seen through the communities who have spoken out, have spoken about how their children are not able to go to school, how their children are captured by elements within their communities that simply don't care. You have children who've dropped out of school. So anything from Life Esidimeni, where you've seen families speak out against how they felt disappointed and let down by government, to communities in drug-infested areas that have complained that nothing has been done. 5-year-old children, 6-year-old children are in drugs. How does that happen? Is something we need to ask ourselves. And in as much as the responsibility is on those communities to root out or point out to law enforcement agencies who these individuals are who are peddling drugs in their communities, it's not as easy as that, because you begin to understand that it's whether your neighbor is on drugs or your neighbor's child is peddling drugs. I was shocked to learn that one of the community leaders in these areas that really stood up against the scourge of drugs in their areas, when I asked, I said, but you know who these people are. These are the sons and daughters and fathers and perhaps even mothers of people that you know who are peddling drugs in your communities. And some just said, I'm scared. I'm too scared to speak out. And some of the parents of known drug pushers in these communities have said, well, this is what puts bread on my table. So if my son does not sell drugs, are you going to put food on my table? So the societal ills, poverty, and a host of other things that have led to the deterioration of so many communities is going to need much more government intervention in 2019 if we're not going to see, especially in an election year, where you would see residents take to the streets because they're sick and tired. They're sick and tired of waiting, they say, for the kind of assistance that they believe that they have not received to date.
2018 started off with Jacob Zuma being pushed to resign, and that really set the tone for 2018. It was something they were expecting for the entire 2017, for about 6 months leading up to the beginning of the year, and then it finally happened.
And I would never forget, because I'd recall just before that televised address by the former president, Jacob Zuma, much earlier in the day when he spoke to our senior political reporter, Mswandile Mbeche, everyone had gotten the sense that there would be some sort of defiance from the former president, Jacob Zuma, and he was not going to go because he kept asking, what have I done? But on the other hand, the ANC felt that it was time for him to go. I mean, his leadership basically had been dogged by quite a number of allegations, and I think centre to that, and what really was the straw that broke the camel's back, was his alleged relationship with the controversial Gupta family, which then subsequently, fast forward Valen, had led to what we all saw happen at the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture, where for the very first time all the allegations that had been levelled against the former president, Jacob Zuma. You'd recall some of the testimony, for example, from the likes of Themba Maseko, who was the head of government communications at the time, talking about how he had received calls from Mahlaba Ndlovu on how he was told to allegedly help the Gupta family basically secure a plush business within government communication. So then fast forward from that resignation of the former president, the State Commission of Inquiry into State Capture, which is now starting to paint a picture of what allegedly happened, the extent to which members of the Gupta family had allegedly tried to capture the state. And some could even argue perhaps their perceived arrogance in the manner in which they dealt with the issue, because you must recall it was Justice Zondo who was quite perturbed, and I think many others too, by the manner in which the Gupta family had said they're not willing to come to South Africa to testify. They would do it from wherever they say they would want, because they have absolutely no confidence in basically the law enforcement agencies in South Africa. So you also had, a lot of doubt cast on the credibility of the Hawks and the National Prosecuting Authorities, which some believed were failing to deal or bring members of the Gupta family to book.
How would you say those testimonies actually moved South Africans that we saw at the state capture inquiry? Or do you feel that South Africans they felt like they knew what happened already? So, this was just par for the course?
No, I don't think so. I don't think the extent, because you must remember the information had been coming through in what one would describe as dribs and drabs. One would pick up, a Sunday newspaper and every Sunday read about the extent of what allegedly happened. But with the testimonies themselves, I mean, allegations of death threats, allegations of meetings, clandestine meetings in certain corners, and how it certainly seemed that members of the Gupta family had tried to ensure that half of, in this case, for example, at government communications, that their media entities were basically taken care of by majority of what had been allocated for government communications in terms of their budget. And I think, the murmurs that one would hear sitting inside that commission, and I just mean the engagement that South Africans have been having on social media, and you see what their responses are to many of these stories, I think really that then started to paint a picture of the extent of the crisis that South Africa had found itself in, allegedly at the hands of one family.
For years to come, we're going to be speaking about land expropriation without compensation, and the history books will point back to the year of 2018, where public debates were had, where it was discussed, and where it was decided that this is something that we're going to be doing. We're going to be changing a kind of cornerstone clause in our constitution and allow for land expropriation without compensation.
It was always going to be one of those politicking points, if I may, Valen, because you had the economic freedom fighters as well as the ANC seemingly pushing, one wanting to be seen, some would argue, to be outstaging the other, because the issue of land expropriation without compensation had always been a scene. South Africans almost felt that while political freedom, of course, had been attained, many believed that there had to be a next phase of freedom in South Africa because, black South Africans still feel marginalized when it comes to the economy of South Africa, owning land, the issue of title deeds, owning homes, because, you would know that some of the key issues, if you head to an election, for example, is the handing out of title deeds, and you would obviously look back to how that for any political party would be seen to be, if South Africans believe that they're able to own a piece of land, or they feel that the next phase of freedom in this country would be that of economic freedom. Remember, you'd have the EFF, which has that as the cornerstone of basically what it is as a political party, and the African National Congress seen as the governing party wanting to spearhead this. So it'll be very interesting to watch how all of this pans out, because some sentiments that have been shared from other political parties, example, is that some saying that the expropriation of land without compensation will form, a crisis, a further crisis in South Africa. So, but I think in the majority, it is a move that has been welcomed, because many South Africans believe that the next phase of democracy is something that is needed in South Africa.
And how's it going to set the tone ahead of the elections next year? Because I think everything that's happened this year is in precursor and in prep for what we're going to be seeing.
It's going to be huge, and in actual fact, I think, the next address that we will see the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, address, and of course in his capacity as the ANC President, will be at the January 8th statement in KwaZulu-Natal. And I think moving forward, you will see a lot of what he will say pertaining to the land expropriation without compensation. Because, of course, in an election here, which is next year, it will be one of the key issues that the governing party, the ANC, would want to make sure they keep speaking on, because it is a sticking point for many South Africans, black South Africans.
Let's move on to the community issues. And you mentioned the protests in different coloured communities, the community actually standing up against gangsterism. Yeah. Did you expect them to spread the way that they did, and for, the kind of force that was then needed from government?
It was bound to happen, Valen. It was bound to happen because we had also there'd been pockets of violence related to drugs. And remember that how this all started was with a woman being killed in Westbury. And this was not the first time it was happening. Remember, the SABC is just up the road from Westbury, and we get to hear firsthand every time there is an incident relating to drugs, someone being caught in the crossfire, children being caught in the crossfire. So it was bound to happen. It was, there was bound to be an incident where communities were going to stand up and say enough is enough. And they need just more than the kind of intervention that we're seeing a government place in these particular areas over the past couple of months. So it was bound to happen. And if you look at how it spread, these are communities that feel marginalized. These are communities that feel that government has neglected them, has not done enough, and as far as they're concerned, does not care. So you were bound to see these communities come together and say, enough is enough, we're going to take to the streets, and if that's the only way that government is going to listen, this is what we're prepared to do. But it was unsurprising to see, for example, a Bheki Cele move into these communities. Quite swiftly he did that and tried to put interventions in place, for example, in Westbury with the tactical response unit. But, Valen, that's almost like putting a plaster over a sore that is festering, because it's not going to heal. You're going to have a more permanent solution to the crises of these communities. Again, do they know who these drug lords are, who these drug peddlers are? Yes, they do. But if you dig deep, you have to go deep into the societal issue itself, and you will find communities that are in absolute tatters. They don't know what to do. They're caught between a rock and a hard place in terms of putting food on the table because they know who these drug peddlers are, and simply turning them into the police. And where you get to see in every single community where they seem to have lost faith in the police.
Yeah. And Westbury is just an example of something that's happening in so many communities around South Africa. And you just wonder how the police are actually going to get the antibiotic for that sore and not just continue with the plasters.
Absolutely, Valen. I mean, during the course of 2018 this year, we've been to places like Davidton, where you've got 12-year-olds that are on drugs. Gangsterism, where you've got 7-year-olds that are part of gangs. And it makes you ask the question, what exactly is happening in our communities? And what the minister himself would need to do of police is really to try and restore confidence in the men and women in blue by these communities. Because the rhetoric that you hear throughout all of this is that they would report this to the South African Police Service. There have been allegations of police involvement. In fact, with regard to the issue in Westbury, we have seen members of the South African Police Service who were accused of allegedly trying to help one of the drug peddlers who had been arrested in this particular matter. So, the South African Police Service are really going to have to step it up in 2019, and especially in an election year where most communities would want to use that to raise their grievances with government in an election year.
Chriselda, we are actually going up to 7 o'clock. Would you mind staying over just to chat a little bit about VBS Bank? There's been so much here. To just have 20 minutes to talk to you, we can't wrap up 2018.
Let's get to that, Bella, no problem.
Okay, so that's my colleague Chriselda Lewis. She's going to be staying with us here on Morning Live to unpack a little bit more and look at those top stories that have happened in 2018. For now, though, let's take a break. We'll be back with your headline news at the top of the hour.